And we are back. Our featured guest tonight is a writer-director whose work is becoming well known for its depth and the logistical commitments made to create them. His new film documentary, Echoes of the Invisible, won the Zeiss Cinematography Award at this year's South by Southwest Festival. I watched it myself the other night, and it was just incredibly profound in its depth and its scope. Please give a warm weekly show welcome to writer and director Steve Elkins. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So Steve, how did you get into filmmaking and storytelling?
Oh, kind of a roundabout way. I did go to film school, but when I was finishing college, I kind of wanted to get away from everything I was planning on, which was a film career. And so I realized about the time I was graduating that I had been in school my whole life, and I kind of wanted to do a lot of exploring. I devoted about the next 7 or 8 years to pretty much traveling the world. I was fortunate enough to have a very unique job where I could take off whenever I wanted, for as long as I wanted, and I'd still come back and have work. So I went to, I've never done an exact count, but I probably traveled to roughly around 20 countries over the course of 7 or 8 years. And I was doing a lot of still photography, a lot of writing. I was very active as a musician and a composer during that time, and doing editing. And long story short, this all kind of brought me back into filmmaking at the tail end of it, because I realized that each of those crafts are components of filmmaking, and they're all combined in filmmaking. So I decided to kind of channel all of my efforts into more singular projects, even if they were much more complicated, which essentially became documentary films, which also allowed me to keep traveling, which was great.
And the interesting thing about this film, Echoes of the Invisible, is I presume the amount of travel that was involved to make it. And like I said in the introduction, I've seen the film, but for our viewers, can you give us kind of a rundown of what Echoes of the Invisible is and what it's about?
It's after all these years, I still sometimes struggle to give a concise description of what it is, but kind of by design. So the film is not so much a traditional documentary. I perceive it more as what I've started to call a docureverie, meaning it's more like a daydream in a way. I'm deliberately trying to use the documentary format in ways that I haven't seen it used so much, where instead of having a very clear, specific topic that you go out and interview the experts on and argue a thesis about, perhaps, you kind of like take in all of this information, almost an overwhelming amount of information that seems disconnected, but is edited together in a way that evokes kind of a daydream state. Like when you're, laying in the grass somewhere looking at the sky or the clouds, and just sort of your brain is intuitively making connections between things where you might not like intellectually understand how these things are connected, but you have an inner sense of harmonic understanding between these things. So that's what I did in this film. Was I took a bunch of seemingly unconnected stories that I found had harmonic underlying themes, and I juxtaposed, bounced back and forth between these stories so that the viewer can go on a journey of trying to figure out what the connections are, and then figure out what it's actually about. So the main storylines involved, I contrast the story of an athlete, Al Arnold, who was blind and he was the first person to run all the way across Death Valley in the middle of summer. It's one of the hottest places on earth. I also filmed a photographer, Rachel Sussman, who devoted 10 years to traveling the world to find and photograph the world's oldest continuously living things, which were, she gave herself a benchmark of they had to be at least 2,000 years old and still alive. I also contrast their stories with the journey of Anil Ananthaswamy, who is a science writer who basically went to the ends of the earth to discover basically where scientists are doing the most extreme experiments, pushing the boundaries of our knowledge. And finally, Paul Solopek, who is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who has devoted pretty much the rest of his life to traveling on foot across the earth, following the DNA trail of our Stone Age ancestors who first discovered the planet. And one of his objectives is to slow journalism down to walking pace, because the way our picture of the world is generated through news is very different when it's slowed down as opposed to like journalists parachuting in and out of stories and locations just to meet the next day's deadlines.
Yeah, he seemed to, it's what I got from that is that there are stories in between the stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And sometimes the stories in between. Go ahead. Sorry about the lag there.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, it's just it's another way to explore connections of our very complex world that oftentimes get bypassed simply by the nature of how news is generated these days.
Well, sometimes it seems that sometimes the stories in between the big, what you would consider to be the big stories, are actually more compelling and more human stories than the big flash stories. And I think I saw some of that, along his walk. By all means. What made you think you could pull off something that was like this grand with this much specialized footage, travel, and overall scope? Was it the travel you did earlier that made you realize logistically you might be able to pull it off?
That probably played some part. I'd say that the real answer to your question is my own personal madness is probably what made me think I could pull it off. But yeah, I mean, I had been kind of traveling to a lot of extreme locations around the world, and actually, even my previous documentary, The Reach of Resonance, I was going to some pretty extreme locations, which I felt kind of prepped me for the unusual conditions in which I'd have to film this project in. So that helped a lot, for sure.
Was there any shooting or scenes that you were trying to get that you were worried you just wouldn't be able to pull off?
Yeah. I mean, most locations I went to had their own unique circumstances. But for example, the very first place I flew to overseas was Chile. And I was filming at very high altitudes in the Andes where astronomers are doing work looking to parts of the cosmos we hadn't seen before. And it's a high enough altitude that you not only need an oxygen mask to breathe and you need constant medical supervision, but what I found is that film equipment, specifically electrical equipment, tends to fail at such high altitudes. It wasn't just the altitude, it was also the cold as well. So for example, my external recording device that I was recording all the footage to would constantly freeze and malfunction in the middle of shots. And basically, we just had to have a lot of patience and try to work through the altitude sickness we were fighting off while trying to get those shots in the first place. So it was very challenging everywhere I went for different reasons.
There's a scene where it looks as if you pick up part of an eclipse or an entire eclipse. Was that by design? Was that happy accident? Was that CGI and fake? What was that? Was that a real eclipse?
It was a real eclipse, but I actually did not film that particular shot, though it was at a location I was at filming. I actually wasn't there when the eclipse happened, so I had an astronomer film that footage, and he let me use it. An astronomer who's on site year-round.
Got it.
So,
got it.
Yeah.
Well, here's what I want to do. I want to go to a break so we can pay some bills, and then I want to come back and talk more about the film and more specifically some of the people that were in it and a little bit more of the logistical challenges and, of course, the award at South by Southwest. So we will be right back after these messages with Steve Elkins.